Hello and good morning friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on rise and development of satire in 18th century in England. Yesterday we conducted first, that is the introductory session where we try to understand the art of satire. Taking the series forward, today we are going to talk on one of the another interesting topics, that is critical analysis of Alexander Pope's The Rape of Lock. And for this discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Debashri Basu. Dr. Basu is assistant professor. She's a professor of English and she's teaching in one of the leading institutions in the country. She has immense knowledge and experience too, and we believe that her experience would definitely help us out in understanding today's topic in detail. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Dr. Debashri Basu, then you can call right in the CEC studios. You can contact us through a toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. You are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture so that you get in-depth analysis of today's discussion. And yes, we believe that your queries will be resolved too in the last 10 minutes. So, taking the lecture forward, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Debashri Basu, once again. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Morning, viewers. In continuation with last lecture series, today's focus, seminal focus, would be on one of the brilliant masterpieces that we have till date, a piece of literary satire, The Rape of the Lock, written by Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, as we know, that he is one of the most representative satirists and literary figures of 18th century Augustan England, and hence, through his writings and through his work, specifically through The Rape of the Lock, the satire achieved its pinnacle of brilliance and glory in the Augustan age. Now, to begin with, the 18th century urban society. Literature of the Restoration and Augustan ages strongly reflects the social functions of satirically exposing the limitations of contemporary society. In Rape of the Lock, Pope delights in revealing the vain pretense and superficial values of 18th century urban fashionable society. The world of the belts and bows that he depicts is treated with criticism, cynicism, yet his satire is never biting or scathing. In fact, sometimes we see as if he is deriving a playful delight in observing his society, so that he appears to be almost half in love with the world that he criticizes. The incident around which the context or the plot of the poem is woven is a private quarrel between two aristocratic families, the Fermors and the Petres, over the cutting of Arabella Fermor's a lock of hair. Now, one can easily deduce that by using a very sexually violent and aggressive term as rape in association with cutting a lock of hair, obviously makes the entire situation extremely ridiculous and humorous. However, Pope uses this incident to introduce a larger satiric account of 18th century England. His satiric tone is robust and vigorous, and in trivializing the issue, he helps us to understand that the priorities of 18th century belts and bows of upper class sophisticated England were severely misplaced and displaced. He indicates the suppressed vulgarity of his society in a very candid and honest manner, at the same time displaying sympathy and consideration for the characters and specifically the leading female protagonist in question. The main target of his satire is the protagonist Belinda, who is the representative of the decadent aristocratic society. Now, since it is modeled on an epic poem and it can be categorized as a mock epic poem, so one can easily understand that he will be exalting the trivial and he will also be ridiculing the seemingly improbable situation that he entirely narrates and recreates in The Rape of the Lock. He describes Belinda as a perfect coquette, showing excessive indifference towards the opposite sex in order to show off and display her chastity and purity. Pope wittingly reveals that though Belinda displays a disinterest in men, she secretly yearns for their company and attention, and allows an earthly lover to lurk at her breast. Pope's satire also reveals his complex attitude towards Belinda. She is on one hand a dreamer, and on the other hand, she is a bundle of chaos and contradictions. Outwardly, like the other women of her society, she maintains a clear reputation, but secretly, she likes to enjoy the youthful indulgences and excesses of her age. She is both a goddess of beauty and an object of satire, through whom Pope again and again tries to ridicule and humor the indulgences and excesses of the 18th century rich beaux and belles. Pope directs his satire against self-love and self-importance of the young men and women of 18th century England. His description of Belinda's dressing table exposes the narcissism and an absolute importance that the age gave to physical appeal and physical love. And I quote from the text, these are from Canto 1, line numbers 125 to 127. A heavenly image in the glass appear, to that she bends, to that her eyes she rears, the inferior priestess at her altar's side, unquote. This is a reference to Belinda's reflection, Belinda's physical charm and physical beauty as Pope depicts. And there is also a reference to her maid-in-waiting, Betty, who is in charge of making Belinda all the more beautiful and charming. The articles, the cosmetic articles on Belinda's dressing tables consists of puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, and billet doux. This shows Belinda's inability to understand the moral and spiritual value of the Bible, which she equals with all her other items of cosmetics. The moral ambiguity of her society is further exposed when Pope shows how a woman's reputation is given more importance than her true feelings of moral integrity. Now, because we are talking about mock epic here, let us take a look at the epic characteristics and the epic conventions. We know that an epic is a long narrative poem which is essentially elevated in grand style and sublime, with great heroes and heroines as the protagonists, and the setting being of a vast and vivid geographical range. The supernatural power, the fantastic elements, element of the oracle, element of the divine, are also some of the significant characteristic features. Pope satirizes and uses all these important epic conventions in a mock epic style, thereby making the exalted the trivial, and the trivial the significant, and so on and so forth. As far as the epic conventions are concerned, the theme is usually the adventure or the narrative of a hero who goes on a war, and one has to invoke the muse's end. Calliope is a classical muse, ask epic questions which are necessarily sublime and serious and somber. They are usually begun in medias res, that is, in the middle of a certain context. Use of figures of speech, epithets, similes, metaphors, climaxes, and anticlimaxes, epigrams are obvious regulations and features. God's interference in human affairs also remains one of the important classical features of epic conventions. And Pope humorously uses, faithfully adapts all these conventions and characteristics in a mock epic style in The Rape of the Lock. Pope's description of Belinda's world is also his satiric perception of the falsity and fragility of his world. Externally, it has great charm and beauty depicted by beautiful vases, exotic crockery from China, fascinating costumes, and sophisticated rituals and practices. Yet, in some lines, some of the important lines in the mock epic, he says, and I quote again, "Forget her prayers or miss her masquerade, or lose her heart or necklace at a ball, or whether heaven has doomed, that shock must fall." Shock is the lapdog of Belinda. So Belinda equates every trivial as well as somber and serious informations and processes them in the same way, without actually prioritizing or putting in hierarchy the elements with effect to seriousness and sobriety. Pope's imaginative touch in the description of the tea ritual, journey along the river Thames, and the game of Ombre reveals the charming appeal of the society. Ironically, the 18th century aristocratic world is full of force and violence, which is suggested again in the word rape, and with repeated reference to acts of cruelty and assault. And I quote here again, this is from Canto 1, line number 71 to 74. "What guards the purity of melting maids in courtly balls and midnight masquerades, safe from the treacherous friend and daring spark, the glance by day, the whisper in the dark." So it seems that in the seemingly beautiful, charming, romantic world of the 18th century Augustan age, of the sophisticated society of belles and beaux, there were also dangers that lurked, and Pope was not oblivious of that fact. He knew that women were dangerous and susceptible to the violence. They were exposed to the dangers of their community as well as to the society. But he also never forgets to ridicule the fact that chastity, purity, rather than being treated as what they are, that is, very traditional, conservative ideals and perspectives of the society, given the time that we are talking about, it was always usually equated with a woman's fidelity, a woman's coquetry. In such a situation, a woman is either pretentiously coy or really innocent, but her position is extremely precarious and dangerous. The cutting of Belinda's hair, which is one of the most important situations, the context in and around which the entire narrative revolves, is metaphorical, is symbolic of the fact that the sanctity of a woman's body is vulnerable and can be violated at any moment. The act, though flavored with humor and ridicule, surfaces the insecurities and indecencies that were prevalent in the society, which were temporarily kept at bay by the glitters of the fashionable society. Now, with this, we come to the mock epic conventions that Pope ridicules and analyzes in The Rape of the Lock. Mock epic is a work that is designed to ridicule attitudes, style, or subject matter by handling either an elevated subject in a trivial manner or a low subject with mock dignity, rendering a trivial subject ridiculous by treating it with the elaborate. And it compares small things with some things great. Pope strongly satirizes the malpractices in 18th century urban society by specifically referring to the corruption of the penal laws. Now, what is brilliant about the structure of The Rape of the Lock is that all the ideas in the lines of the entire poem are so aptly condensed and economically used that throughout the poem, Pope manages to maintain the heroic couplet standard of form, which rhymes in every 2 lines with an iambic pentameter which has 10 syllables in each line, and it alternates with stressed and unstressed syllables. The satire on society by Pope is an attack on the emotional insincerity of the people of Pope's age. Here, he is practically adverse to women and shows that they are more concerned about lapdogs than husbands, or more about their makeup than genuine relationships. I quote here a few important lines from Canto 3, line numbers 447 to 448. Not louder shrieks to pitying heaven are cast when husband or when lapdogs breathe their last, which means over here Pope is equating the fact that for a woman, for a fashionable woman in the 18th century, losing their husband was synonymous to losing their lapdogs. So once again we have a very ridiculous but a brilliant juxtaposition of the trivial and the somber. Pope's satire is at times very strong and very aggressive against the feminine excesses and follies of women. He attacks their unstable, whimsical nature and mockingly attributes their caprice to the sylphs. This is from Canto 1 again, line numbers 99 to 100. With varying vanities from every part, they shift the moving toy shop of their heart, which again and again Pope satirizes and implicates and puts the blame on the whimsical, the lack of allegiance and the lack of loyalty on the part of females who constantly shifted their attention by virtue of their coquetry from one man to the other, only to attract attention from the opposite sex. To criticize women, Pope also comes up with the theory that each woman, according to her nature, is turned into a spirit after her death. So for those who believe, traditionally, conservatively believe, that 18th century Augustan satire was a far cry from imagination, it was too superficial, it was too artificial, and it did not pay any heed to imagination, then here is the reply. In the use of fantastic elements, in the use of supernatural machinery in the form of the sylphs, the gnomes, the salamanders, Pope uses remarkable wit together with a brilliant imagination. The fiery woman turned into salamander, the soft yielding minds became nymphs, the prudes became gnomes, and the coquettes turned into sylphs. Incidentally, Ariel, an important figure in the Rape of the Lock, is a sylph who is also the guardian angel of Belinda, who is in charge of protecting Belinda's purity and chastity from the men of the opposite sex. Pope uses his sharp wit, irony, and humor to satirize a highly mannered society. Yet, he never expresses any revulsion or disgust. Though he criticizes the fashionable 18th century, he dilutes the sharp edges of satire with his genial and sympathetic tone. He might be suggestive, direct, and aggressive at times, but never in his aggression does he loses his hold on humor, ridicule, and wit. And that is why, essentially, from all the lines of the Rape of the Lock, we can derive that wit, that humor, which makes it not only a very pleasant read satirically, but also an exceptionally beautiful read aesthetically. There is very little that is romantic in Pope's essential intention behind the writing of the Rape of the Lock. Like other satirists of his time, his fundamental interest was to expose the follies and limitations of man and society. This satiric purpose reveals mainly his critical temper. However, in the poem, his presentation of affluent and fashionable world of bows and bells is constantly touched by the fanciful aspect of his mind. In many of his descriptions of the practices and rituals of 18th century sophisticated society, Pope expresses his romantic trend of mind. For this reason, the poem never becomes a scathing criticism, but rather a sympathetic one. The essential romantic aspect of Pope's mind is expressed in the poem in his use of fancy, which transforms a real-life incident into a mock heroic epic. Right from the title of the mock epic poem itself, he juxtaposes the trivial with the somber and the serious. The rape of the lock, the two operative words in the title, the rape as well as the lock, are juxtaposed within the span of a few words in order to trivialize and also exalt in the same manner the insignificant. It is also a part of Pope's brilliance and ingenuity that he applies all the features of an epic, though in an inverted manner, to a real-life incident, metamorphosing into a poetic experience of lasting appeal. Elevating the incident to an epic scale, he compares the heroine to an epic hero, her elaborate dressing rituals to the army of warriors, her journey down the river Thames to the epic journey, the card game of Umber at Hampton Court to the epic battle, the tea ritual to the epic feast, and the loss of her lock of hair to the epic disaster. Not once does he miss the mark or he miss the point. So every important incident throughout the 5 cantos in The Rape of the Lock has some epic incident or the other to complement it with the mock epic. The romantic bend of Pope's mind has also been expressed in different forms of exaggeration. One such fanciful exaggeration is the description of Belinda's dressing table and her ritual. Undoubtedly, Pope desires to satirize Belinda's obsession with beauty. Yet, these descriptions are so exaggerated that they provide us with a magnificent insight into the world of Belinda's cosmetic powers. As Belinda sits at her dressing table like the goddess of pride, her maid Betty is put in charge to further escalate and intensify her beauty. She selects from each of her articles objects of adornments and with great care and skill adorns the goddess with cosmetic powers. We usually talk about cosmetic powers here in this case because one of the essential equipments with which Belinda equips herself, beauty with charm, is essentially her cosmetics. So instead of cosmic powers, which obviously has a very divine spiritual connotation association with it, Pope uses cosmetic powers. So again, the juxtaposition here is very prominent. And these are the lines which I quote again from Canto 1, line numbers 140 to 142. The fair each moment rises in her charms, repairs her smiles, awakens every grace, and calls forth all the wonders of her face. Now in Canto 1, there are some important subsections to which this specific canto can be divided. Belinda's awakening from sleep, her dream in which Ariel, her guardian angel, warns her of an impending disaster, and Belinda's preparation for the day's social activities, all points one after the other to the amount of inactivity that actually the belles and beaux of 18th century fashionable society of England indulged in, because they did not practically have anything worthwhile, anything substantial to look forward to. Because according to them, playing cards, sipping tea, visiting, gossiping, these all summarized their main existence and their daily routines of the day. Another glimpse into the romantic fancifulness of Pope is his description of Belinda's journey to Hampton Court along the River Thames in a magnificent barge. And this description is so splendid that it immediately reminds us of Shakespeare's play and Cleopatra, where Enobarbus had brilliantly described Cleopatra's beauty, her glory, and her brilliance and radiance on the barge. He attributes divinity, Pope attributes divinity to Belinda's character in these lines. She eclipses the brightness and the radiance of the sun as well by bringing joy and gaiety into the world of fashion. And there is this very important line over here which Pope uses on Belinda, and that is, Belinda smiled and the entire world was gay. So such was the power of Belinda's smile, such was the magnetic power of her charm, that when she smiled, the entire world around her became happy and joyous. She becomes an embodiment of grace and sweetness that covers up and compensates for all her follies and flirtations. Pope asserts, and this is in Canto 2, line numbers 165 to 166, I quote, "If to her share some female errors fall, look on her face and you'll forget them all." So her face has that magnetic charm to make any onlooker and observer oblivious of her coquetry and flirtatious nature. It is not only Belinda's beauty that is imaginatively heightened here, but also Pope's depiction of the entire scenery, the sky, the breeze, and the sunlight, when he states, again, Canto 2, line numbers 196 to 198, "The sun beams trembling on the floating tides, while melting music steals upon the sky, and softened sounds along the waters die." So the lilt in these lines, the use of words that Pope uses in these lines essentially shows the imaginative, the romantic imagination that Pope uses in these lines of the canto. Pope's romantic fancy never fails to impress us in his rendering of the tea ritual at the Hampton Court. After the card game, cups and spoons are laid on the table. The berries of the coffee plant produced a crackling sound. A bright lamp was placed on a Japanese tray and lighted. Thereafter, this is Canto 3, line numbers 399 to 400, from silver spouts the grateful liquors glide, while China's earth receives the smoking tide. So it's a brilliant way of actually describing that how the hot tea poured out from the snout of the silver teaware into the cups kept in front of them. So such details not only speaks about the economical way and the condensed and apt way in which Pope uses his poetic diction, his phrases, but it also talks about the imagination and the romantic element that is there behind the description of these lines. So the card game has been transformed into an epic battle. Now, till now, we have seen that how Pope's romantic bent of mind is at play. The other half of the lecture, we will go further into the details of the rest of the cantos. romantic bend of Alexander Pope's mind. The card game, which is the game of Ombre that Pope describes in the subsequent cantos, also talks about his romantic imagination to a great extent, where all the four important groups of cards almost gets elevated to an epic battle and also the battle of the sexes. The card game has been transformed by Pope into an epic battle, expressing the imaginative opulence of Pope's mind. The poet gives a mock heroic simile where the defeat of the combined army of hearts, diamonds, and clubs resemble the defeat of the great army at epic proportions of the Asiatics and Africans who were wearing diverse garments when dispersed were all thrown alike into wild disorder and are killed in large numbers by their enemy. Now, any kind of epic battle entailed chaos and a lot of commotion. Now, the epic battle here, which he ridicules and satirizes, is in Canto 3, which is the card game of Ombre. Here, the satire is directed at the dysfunctional socio-political system of the age, which also talks about the aristocratic excesses and indulgences. Through the card game of Ombre, Pope again and again attacks and ridicules the excesses and indulgences which the aristocratic beaux and belles constantly looked upon. They took the card game so seriously as if their entire existence depended upon it. So, the extent to which Pope increased the intensity and escalated the importance of the card game in the life of such aristocratic belles and beaux were obviously ridiculous and humorous to the point of brilliance. Pope's depiction of the cave of Spleen in Canto 4 is another brilliant example of his romantic imagination. Belinda's ill-natured mood after her not so important victory at the game of Ombre affects her mood and affection after the loss of the lock of hair as well. By the time we reach the description of the cave of Spleen in Canto 4 in the poem, we already have seen that Belinda has lost her precious lock of hair, which has been cut off by the Baron in the poem. Now, because of this loss of the lock of hair, Belinda is in an exceptionally ill-natured mood and affection after the loss of the lock. Umbreon, the earthly gnome, descends to the cave of Spleen in order to ask the queen for a potion that would further escalate Belinda's ill-natured mood. Because Ariel and the other guardian sylphs of Belinda always took into consideration the fact that Belinda's mood is never spoiled, Umbreon, the mischievous gnome, now decides to pay a visit to the queen in the cave of Spleen, and in order to bring back a potion from there which would escalate and intensify the ill temper and bad mood of Belinda, so that she gets into a war of words with Thalestris, her another companion till then, but now an opponent. Thalestris' speech arouses the rage of Belinda here. Sir Plume in Canto 4 becomes another example of an aristocratic fop whom Pope satirizes in exceptionally sarcastic and strong manner, as well as ridiculous as well. Pope's depiction of the cave of Spleen expresses no less imaginative power than that to be found in Dante's Inferno. The cave is at the center of the earth, ruled by the goddess of spleen. It epitomizes the dominant passion of ill temper and affectation in the poem. Spleen, which is also known as ill humor, caused the quarrel between the two families of the Pitres and the Fermors. The whole passage has a dreamy quality which speaks greatly of Pope's satiric and imaginative skill. Now, these are lines from Canto 4, 487 to 488, and while describing the cave of Spleen, these are the two lines which brilliantly points out the exact temperament that Spleen highlights or showcases in a human being. No cheerful breeze this sullen region knows, the dreadful east is all the wind that blows. A cloud of mist hangs constantly over the cave where strange, unreal forms are visible. They are either dreadful as the dreams of an ascetic in a place haunted by some evil spirit, or bright as the vision of a female saint when she is about to expire. The romantic bend of Pope's mind definitely enhances the aesthetic beauty of the poem. The trivial theme is transformed into a work of epic proportions, into a work of art by his sheer fancy and imagination. The result being the world, which is otherwise commonplace beneath all its shine and glitter, gets transformed and enlivened into something which becomes extremely important and prioritized throughout the mock epic. The poet's concluding consolation to his romantic heroine Belinda is charged with his playful fancy, almost unmatched in a similar class of poetry. Now, one of the main additions that The Rape of the Lock had was in Canto 5, which we know today as the speech of Clarissa. When Rape of the Lock was initially published in 1712, it did not have any moral voice or moral purpose in the poem, which Pope thought was important to add, and hence he added on Clarissa's speech in Canto 5 and republished it in 1717. Now, all readers of The Rape of the Lock cannot forget the voice of sanity, the voice of gravity, the voice of intelligence and moral didactic purpose through Clarissa. The name rings a bell with clarity. So Clarissa renders an important clarification in the poem and also talks about the main intention behind Pope's taking up this subject matter and dealing with it. The main intention behind writing The Rape of the Lock was that Pope wanted the Fermors and the Pitres to have good sense and good humor. It is not only about these two families, two warring families that he talks about in The Rape of the Lock. He is in general making a plea, addressing all his audience and readers of the age to imbibe good sense and good humor, to be able to embrace ridicule and thereby understand what are the follies and eccentricities that needs to be taken care of, that needs to be polished, and that needs to be eradicated and cured. All readers of The Rape of the Lock will remember Clarissa, the grave pundit of the Hampton Court, whose elegant little lecture on good sense and good humor touches the semblance of sanity and adds to the moral purpose in the poem. The other inhabitants of her toy shop society we merely laugh at, but when it comes to Clarissa, we do listen to her. Probably when we keep the other female characters at bay like Belinda and Thalestris, we know that they are the object of Pope's satire. But Clarissa is not the object of Pope's satire. Clarissa has been planted there by Pope in order to give a certain kind of moral clarity to his otherwise mock epic poem. But one also needs to keep in mind that the basic intention, the basic association that Pope has towards the entire world of The Rape of the Lock is also very strange and ambiguous. That is why, even though we consider Clarissa as the fundamental moral voice in the poem, we should also keep in mind that Clarissa was also instrumental in giving the weapon, that is, the pair of scissors, to the Baron so that he could cut off the lock of hair from Belinda. This act of Clarissa makes her a complex and a layered character, and that is why, as readers of The Rape of the Lock, we should not have a very limited and unidimensional association and unidimensional perspective towards Clarissa. Rather, we should try and analyze her character and interpret her with all the complexities and all the layers that her character actually promises. Clarissa alone possesses the sense to discern that frail beauty must decay. So all the importance, significance that one gives to physical charm and physical beauty and physical appeal is brought down and ridiculed by Pope through Clarissa's voice when she says that anything that is physical, anything that is tangible is also transient. It will pass away. It has a short-lived shelf life. And that coquetry is ultimately self-defeating. She alone understands the irresistible nature of good humor, the enduring attraction of merit. And these are the points of significance which Pope wants his readers to not only be entertained with, but also to be enlightened with. Clarissa's speech undoubtedly carries the moral of the poem, touching some of its deepest chords, while at the same time exhibiting the radical limitations of even the degree of maturity in the society in which it is so firmly set. Given the kind of world that Alexander Pope was depicting, and the ambiguous attitude that he chose to adopt towards it, because one should not forget that Pope, though he satirizes the excesses and indulgences of the world of the rape of the lock, he also seems to be half in love with it. Otherwise, the brilliance, the radiance, the romantic charm, imitation with which he satirizes the world wouldn't have been possible. There is an objective brilliance, but there is also a subjective charm in his technique. Clarissa can be touched with both sublimity and comicality, because if we see her purely as a saint, then we would ignore her lack of tact, her hypocrisy, and her ill-concealed delight in the victory that she generates, that she derides after Belinda loses her lock of hair. On the other hand, conversely, if we see her purely as a prude, then we ignore her sanity, we ignore her grasp on basic realities, such as the transience of beauty, her laudable appreciation of good sense and good humor, and her forthrightness. The careful reader will find himself maneuvered into seeing her both ways simultaneously, because the rape of the lock in itself is much more than just a poem that can be categorized only as a mock epic poem. It is a documentation, it is a manifesto of the entire world that Pope lays bare in front of us. The careful reader will find himself maneuvered, therefore, into seeing all these complex layers that are there, one after the other, simultaneously, brilliantly juxtaposed in the poem. It's a paradox incarnate, unusually discerning and sympathetic on one hand, but devious and self-interested on the other as well. The game of ombre, that is the card game, one of the chief metaphors of the poem, vividly dramatizes the battle of the sexes. At the same time, however, it draws our attention to the psychological games that are components on the larger scale, that is, contents of adroitness and craft, such as are proper to gamesmanship. Most of these battles are between the belles and the beaux. It's a battle of the sexes, it is a battle of the wits, of course, but not all. Here, for example, we have also the secretly jealous Thalestris, who poses as a friend to Belinda, but obviously sees her as a competition in the sexual war of coquetry, because she wishes her prophecies about Belinda might be self-afflicting. And I quote here again from Canto 4, these are line numbers 107 to 110. "Methinks already I your tears survey, already hear the horrid things they say, already see you a degraded toast, and all your honor in a whisper lost. So Thalestris wants Belinda to be publicly shamed, to be publicly humiliated, which also shows that the women of the time in question were not only susceptible and volatile to the opposite sex, but also towards their own sex as well, who considered chastity and purity to be so fragile that it could be lost in a moment through a whisper or a gossip. Thalestris' speech comically reminds us that they are equally lively wars going on between members of the same sex. The exclusively female contest of principal concern, carefully controlled flirtations and other, for all her sanity, at heart, a prude who thrives on piety and moral imperialism. In actuality, the two are not so very different. So when we talk about Belinda, in all her coquetry, in all her physical charm, in all the importance that she gives to physical charm, it is not very difficult for us to understand that the perceptions towards beauty, the perception towards physical appeal, the understanding of physical appeal as both these women, Belinda and Thalestris, perceive of, are not very different from one another. Because though they pose as coquettes, they are also prudes. And in this lies their inherent hypocrisy. If Ariel, the guardian angel, the guardian sylph of Belinda, had successfully urged Belinda to hear and believe thy own importance new, Umbreon, the mischievous gnome, has doubtless at some point whispered advice in Clarissa's ear. Belinda's strong suit is her physical attractiveness, whereas Clarissa's is her unimpeachable respectability. It is this natural rivalry between prude and coquetry that prompts Clarissa to take arms against Belinda midway through the third canto. Clarissa's act speaks of itself and severely undercuts her characterization as a grave prude. So here I quote those lines from Canto 3, line numbers 125 to 130, where actually Clarissa undermines her characteristic nature as a saint, as a moral voice in the poem, and takes out the weapon, which is the pair of scissors, and hands it over to the Baron so that the Baron can cut off Belinda's precious lock of hair. Just then Clarissa drew with tempting grace a two-edged weapon from her shining case. So ladies in romance assist their knight, present the spear, and arm him for the fight. Unquote. It may be said that instead of partly clarifying the poem's putative moral, as most readers say and believe, Clarissa actually complicates and enriches it. The fact that she is such a layered character prevents us from interpreting her or decoding her as a very unidimensional, straightforward character. Rather, she is a character who is too much complex and too much multi-layered for our own good. Because the moment we categorize the Rape of the Lock as just a mock epic poem and shift our focus from the important characteristic features that Pope constantly talks about through Belinda, through Thalestris, through the Rosicrucian machinery, through Clarissa's character, we miss the mark here. Clarissa actually complicates and enriches her characteristic portrayal mainly in three principal ways. Firstly, by adopting unwittingly some of the conventional values of her modish world. Secondly, by demonstrating the good sense that does not necessarily exclude pity and self-interest. And thirdly, by parodying a speech that threatens to trivialize her basic concerns. Each of these complications indicates that her objectivity and range of vision while considerable, are nonetheless limited. So she cannot be prioritized completely as a saint, neither can she be categorized completely as a prude. She almost comes halfway in between at a point of intersection between a prude and a saint. Superior as her general awareness may be to the other female protagonists like Clarissa and Belinda nonetheless, it still does not enable her to transcend the poem's continually double perspective, principally because she is as blind to her vanity as Belinda and Clarissa are. So, even though Clarissa is the moral voice of the poem, she remains as fallible and as vulnerable as the other two. And it is through her fallibility and through her vulnerability that Pope makes her exceptionally human. And that is why the poem, despite having such a distinct moral voice through Clarissa's character, does not sound to be preaching and sermonizing. Because Pope, through Clarissa, renders an important moral, an important ideal, an important principle in the poem, but also conversely satirizes and ridicules the moral voice as well through her ambiguity and limitedness. Principally because she is blind to her own vanity as she is fully aware of the others. She may criticize the beau monde for its foolish priorities, but she also clearly enjoys it, which is very explicitly stated in her lines. And she wants to be a part of it and being a cut-out figure for itself. Significantly, in her speech, she includes herself among those beauties who own a coach and take pains with their appearance. So therein, somehow, Pope brings along Clarissa, Belinda and Clarissa all at the same platform. Thus, Clarissa, no less than Belinda, remains paradoxical to the end. She espouses good humor, good sense, but ironically shows little sign of it in either manner or in mien. She urges Belinda to be a good sport while unsportingly being a conspirator in the belle's undoing. Given these inconsistencies in her behavior, it is understandable that her response to her be one of mingled admiration and antipathy. So therefore, what becomes important is here that despite the fact that Pope gives a very important moralistic undertone to the Rape of the Lock, he never makes it unduly sermonizing and preachy, because that would have taken away from the mock epic its importance in understanding. Also, when we are dealing with mock epic, we have to be essentially perceptive towards the inherent ridicule, the inherent wit, and the inherent laughter that is there. So, a very direct and prominent moral purpose would have taken away from the Rape of the Lock its most important comic brilliance that is there in the poem, which even Clarissa's presence does not allow us to take it away. Hence lies Pope's brilliance, that till the very last line of the Rape of the Lock, it remains an essentially important mock heroic poem. Pope's desire of writing a mock heroic epic resulted from the idea of difference between the heroic world of the epic and the fashionable and elite world of his contemporary society. Since he chose to use the epic conventions in a satirical way, he had to follow the important conventions of including supernatural machinery. However, he could not use the Olympian gods that were used by Homer or the angels of Milton, because in the 18th century world of reason and enlightenment, such a use would have been too simplistic. So, he uses a most imaginary and fanciful supernatural machinery consisting of sylphs, gnomes, salamanders. Taken from the French book La Conte de Gaboli by Aimé de Montfaucon. These supernatural creatures represent 4 elements of air, water, earth and fire respectively. These agents taken from the Rosicrucians renders great beauty of description to the poem and addresses the satire all the more. Pope's romantic imagination is not only seen in how he depicts the world, but is also seen in all these important supernatural machinery that he uses in the poem, who are all there to assist Belinda one after the other in her supposed journey of purity and chastity. Pope uses this imaginative theory that these supernatural creatures are the spiritual reincarnations of different kinds of women. After death, angry and fiery women turn into salamanders, the soft and yielding ones turn into nymphs, the graver and the cruder ones become gnomes, and the light coquettes become airy sylphs. So through the character analysis of the sylph Ariel and the gnome Umbreon, we see this huge difference between their characteristics, which are essentially because of their inherent features that they possessed when they were women. The protagonist Belinda in the poem is an elegant and fashionable lady belonging to the affluent social class. Pope thus uses the sylphs to emphasize on her airs and mannerisms. Ariel becomes the guardian sylph who is primarily in charge of safeguarding Belinda's purity and chastity. He, together with 50 other sylphs, are in charge of protecting Belinda and enhancing her physical appeal and beauty, so that she is skilled enough, capable enough to go out into the world and conquer it with her charm in full glory. Pope isolates Ariel as Belinda's guardian angel. As Ariel performs a strong choric role in the poem by commenting again and again on the protagonist's thought of action. Together with a host of associate sylphs who have the solemn responsibility of safeguarding Belinda's virginity and honor, appearing in an epic dream vision, Ariel constantly instructs Belinda about the basic Rosicrucian principles of virtue, sanctity, chastity, and purity. Ariel warns Belinda, "O pious maid, beware of all, but most beware of man." Ariel's warning of Belinda is Pope's way of satirizing her puritanic conscience. She follows the sylph's advice as she is aware of the need for an untarnished image. Now, in using Belinda as an important metaphor, as an important figure, Alexander Pope actually again and again satirizes the world that he wishes to comment on and ridicule. We shall continue with the latter half of the lecture shortly. So, thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session. And dear friends, we would be meeting again very soon, and in our future sessions, we would be continuing further and knowing more and more on this particular series. If you want to give your feedback for today's lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Your feedbacks are important for us. With this note, thank you. Thank you so very much. Thank you, ma'am.